Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the latest live episode of the Free Marketeers. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Chris. I'm joined by someone I've followed now for a few years, someone who I always look to when there's discussions around economics, and I look to him to make sense of what's going on in the world around us when everyone is wailing and ranting about things. He speaks a lot of common sense, I think. Today we are joined by Mike Schüssler. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris.
For those of you who don't know Mike, he is the owner of economists.co.za, an economic consultancy, and he also does work with Brenthurst Wealth Management. So, Mike, I thought we would start off today with your presentation, a few slides that you have for us, unpacking some trends in the economy of South Africa, some of the data that you've looked at and that you've tried to see what that tells us about what's going on in the world. I mean, for some people, when they hear stuff like GDP numbers, interest rates, they think it's sort of abstract things divorced from our lives. But I think these trends tell us fundamentally about what's going on around us. Of course, politics affects all this economics, and we can maybe at some point talk about some of those aspects. But I think over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Today we're going to talk about profits. It's something that South Africa doesn't really talk much about. You can see the screen, I hope, and you'll be able to follow what I'm going to be trying to say. But what essentially I'm going to be talking about is why profits matter and why it matters for growth, investment, employment. And we're going to give you some really big numbers towards the end, which I think you will understand and appreciate how important this is. So I'll just set the agenda, what we're talking about. I'm going to talk about vanity, sanity, and reality. I'll tell you what that is just now. What fewer profits have done for South Africa, what it can change for us, because it's important that we pull it through to tell people what does that mean and what needs to be done to get there. And then if you guys feel like it, or girls, we can have some questions. So the first thing is turnover is vanity. Every businessman will gladly tell you what their turnover is. They don't always tell you what their profits are because that is not something they want to give away. You very often find somebody saying, oh, got a R1 billion company. They might not be making profits, however, so they're just looking at the turnover. And the profit is the part that we should be measuring. The other part that is actually reality is cash flow. And cash flow gives us that underpinning why things don't just collapse and why we can have a more positive future in South Africa if we think about it really well. So I'm going to just give you background as to what I'm talking about. Obviously, profits are in the private sector, and the part of the private sector I'm concentrating on is the non-financial private sector. In my opinion, that is the real economy. That creates all the jobs. Government cannot exist if the private sector is not there to be taxed and to provide services for, if you wish. And the other thing is these are quarterly numbers. They come from Stats SA in the main, and it comes from the quarterly financial statistics. And we've also got something to say that there's a lack of data for agriculture, forestry, and fishing in this. But if you think about it, it is in a way there because a co-op that is selling the farmers fertilizer and things like that, that will be part of the non-financial private sector. And so with the factories that process our chickens or our cereal, that's what we do have. Not everything is private as we think about it, because an enterprise such as Eskom or Transnet would fall into these sectors because they're supposedly going to make a profit. Business services are included, so things like research, security, and advertising, but no banks, insurers, or stockbrokers, because they are the ones that are lending the private sector money. They're the ones insuring, they're the ones selling and buying companies, and they therefore need the real economy also to exist, just like the government does. And the non-financial private sector is a way that we measure across the world. I'll show you some numbers from the BIS on debt later, and that gives you a very good idea. But what is also important to note, I'm talking about the whole private sector, not just the JSE companies. So when I work for Brenthurst Wealth, I'll be comparing the JSE perhaps. When I'm doing this, I am going to be looking at the broader economy. A lot of these private enterprises are very small, obviously. But the first thing is later this morning, GDP will come out. But here's an indication of how bad the private sector got hit. The private sector here is in blue, and in 6 of the last 7, 7 of the last 8 quarters, it has been declining. And it is a bit frightening that happened. And whereas the economy on a year ago basis shrank with about 17% in the second quarter, it was 25% for the non-financial private sector. And it did a very good bounce back, however. The bounce back has been incredible, from -25 to -8. That's a huge change. And that shows you that there's something underlying our private sector that's really helpful. We'll see how the fourth quarter data looks. But if we then just start with what I'll be talking about is, let's look at turnover. This is just simply the turnover of the real economy in South Africa, that private sector, non-financial private sector. And you can see that the turnover, even in nominal terms, has gone negative in the last while. But so far, not as negative as we've seen with, for example, in 2008. So that's a pretty good sign. Taking away the impact of inflation, we, however, have been in negative territory for a long time here on the turnover side. And that's not very helpful, but it is just turnover. Sometimes some companies just need to shrink a little bit because they may be in places where they feel they're not going to be profitable and they're reorganizing themselves. But nonetheless, the whole South African private sector being negative for the best part of 3 years is certainly not a very good sign for us. The next thing is profitability. So if I look at the assets that these companies have, and I look at what is the profits they've made, and I can see that I've got to take away the interest rate, because you could, if you had those assets and you put them in the bank, if you could sell them just as an exercise, you do actually a little bit better. That's that black line. That's where those are. So every time the red line, the private sector returns, are less than the money market rate, it is not positive in general for fixed investment. And you can see that in the blue line. And the fixed investments and profitability in the economy do tend to go quite a bit hand in hand. Yes, there is sometimes a bit of a delay one way or the other. And there is probably sometimes just people that say, let's take the chance and invest anyway. But nonetheless, I think there's a very big rate of agreement or correlation between the private sector profits and capital formation. And it has certainly really knocked the capital formation because the lockdowns obviously stopped construction. But even in the third quarter, it wasn't looking very good at all. And another reason this matters is if we look at a return on assets smoothed over a 4-quarter moving average, you can see that it's got an inverse relationship, virtually perfect relationship with unemployment. So if you look at the unemployment rate, which is on my left-hand side in blue, you can see it's inverse. So it starts at 28 and it goes to 42. And as our profits have shrunk in the economy, our unemployment rate has actually increased from just under 30%, this is the broad unemployment rate, to about 42%. This is really, really tough. And that says to you, employment and fixed investment and profits go together. You can see that very clearly in this slide. This hasn't been done by many, and it's not well known because we don't look at this sort of number in South Africa. And that is because we don't look at profits. Profits create jobs. That is a fact. And if we take it in a broader sense, and we look at how many adults are employed in a country such as South Africa, so I've now no longer got an inverse. I'm saying in 2008, around 46% of South African adults were employed. And that had dropped to roughly 36% or so in this, and that's as profits dropped. And it bounced back, but there's certainly a big drop here in this working age population of ours. And yes, you can see there was certainly a shock. It shouldn't have dropped quite as much. I think it would have shown a much better. But if your profits are not there, then it's very difficult to increase your employment enough to take into account the actual growth of the working age population. And another way to look at it is, the last way to look at this is, well, if people aren't making that much profit, why are they not closing down? So you have to think of a business owner here, and a business owner would be looking and saying, well, I don't need to include depreciation. So I don't need to worry about replacing my truck. I'll run the truck for another 2 or 3 years, see if I've got the money then, or just save a little, a bit less to replace that truck. So instead of doing it over 5 years, I do it over 8 years, or the building or whatever. And I don't buy other assets and sell any other of my assets. Then you look, even after inflation, South Africa has a positive real cash flow. And that means the owner has got cash on hand. And remember, many of the owners or managers of firms are also receiving a salary. That salary is part of the cost. It's not part of the cash flow. So they remain in where they are, and they're not going to give it up. But they've also got a little bit of positive cash flow with which they could either pay dividends because they're not going to put the money away for that depreciation, or they can save that money to buy new stuff later. So that is the vanity, sanity, and reality. Reality is cash flow. And I'm now going to show you what this has done to South Africa. In terms of fixed investment, foreign fixed investment, if I look at South Africa and I say, how much do South African companies invest overseas and how much do overseas companies invest in South Africa? It turns out we South Africans invest far more in other countries than those other countries invest in us. And as a percentage of GDP, you can see here from the time period of the sort of mid-70s, there was financial sanctions, trade embargoes, and a lot. So people were not interested in investing in apartheid South Africa. We turned the corner, and shortly after we had a new government, we found a lot more foreign companies wanting to invest in South Africa. Yes, some of our companies, like Anglo-American, became foreign companies, and therefore their investments counted as foreign. That's true too. But now again, we did attract, and we had about a 24% more foreigners in our investing in South Africa as a percentage of our GDP investment than we invested in foreigners. And that was in the mid-2000s. 15 years later, the situation has turned around completely. At the end of this month, we'll get the latest of these numbers from the Reserve Bank. and I'd like to see where we are. But at the moment, we're roughly at 38% less foreign investment in South Africa, negative, than foreigners have invested here. So that's a very big turnaround. And that says to me that despite all those conferences, the businesses have not invested in South Africa. It's seen as a PR exercise. If you follow the money, it says to you nothing is happening. We should have had 3 trillion rand more investment in South Africa. Not a few billion extra, 3 trillion extra. Yes, we started with a PR. Yes, we have conferences. That's a small step. But I'm telling you now what the business say in those conferences and what is happening in the real world of where the money is. The money flows to where the best returns are and the least risk. And I think in South Africa, it's not just the returns, it's also the risk. And I'll put it in another way. This slide says something that I think we need to point out to the many South Africans out there. We are the only major emerging market in the world. Only emerging market in the world, major emerging market in the world, with a net outflow of foreign direct investment. You can see we're right at the bottom there. We have a $60 billion outflow. Most of these countries have inflows, and around about 25% of the sort of typical emerging market economy is made up of fixed direct investment, foreign fixed direct investment, net. South Africa is one of the top 10 in the world, if not in the top 5 providers of capital. Yes, South Africa provides other countries with money to grow their economies. That's what it boils down to. We provide other countries with money so that they can grow, even though we do not have enough money ourselves. And that is because we're not growing. We're increasing the risk of investments in South Africa, and the risk-reward ratio is wrong. If you look at this whole situation, we're a capital poor country. We're outside of the top 10 or top 30 economies in the world, yet we've definitely been in the top 10 exporters of capital when you look at the UN UNCTAD trade data, the IMF data on net outflows and so on. So it's very clear. And we have about a 35% outflow, whereas we should have had about a 25% inflow. That's about 60% of GDP. Seeing that our GDP is roughly 5 trillion, that means we should have had an extra 3 trillion rand. Yes, 3 trillion rand. That is far, far more than the corruption that is estimated to have cost the economy 1.5 trillion. I'm saying this is also the result of poor government, corruption, and this is having a very, very big impact. And I'm going to get to jobs now. But the knock-on impact is more than 3 trillion. Remember that too. So the fact that government hasn't noticed this, academics haven't noticed this is not part of your normal press that you see, and the data is available freely. It is just a matter of putting it together. It is official data. It comes from official sources. None of these are a Mike Schüssler dreamt up sort of thing. This is all Stats SA, IMF, UN data, so on. There's 3 trillion rand missing in the South African economy. Wouldn't anybody think about this? If I look at the next slide, which is going to just show you that we use about 400,000 rand in 2010 money per job or per a person in the active labor market. But because we have a high unemployment rate and also some people not really meaningfully employed, I would say that the cost is about 166,000 rand. If I then turn it into 2021 money, it's roughly 1 million rand per meaningful job in South Africa that you need in capital. But this gives me a way of saying, I'm not saying it's perfect, but if we had 3 trillion rand extra invested in this economy, we should have had 3 million more jobs. Now that's huge, because that means that the 11 million people unemployed now, or before COVID it was 10, it would have been only 7 or 8 million. And that would have made a lot more taxpayers. It would have relieved a lot of poverty, inequality, and all those things. So let's see what would have happened. The first thing that would have happened is our GDP per capita compared to the rest of the world, or the average of the world, would have stayed closer, say at 90% or 95%. You can see it started heading down just at the same time that foreign direct investment started creeping out of our country and then finally flowing out very quickly. So now we're only 74% as rich as the average world citizen. That's not good, not good at all. I don't want to stay in a poor country. And the trend here is very worrisome. You can see in a matter of 3 years, we've lost 6% on the rest of the world. 6%. So that's 2% a year. We know in 2020, the whole world had a knockdown effect. The world economy is estimated to have declined about 4.5%. For South Africa, that's about 7.5%. Because we've got about 0.5% more population growth, it means we've probably had, compared to the rest of the world, another 3.5% decline. So we now will be closer to 70% of the world, and we are going to fall further because we are not catching up quite as quickly. The per capita per person employed in South Africa, if we look at it in purchase power parity terms, South Africans in general who are employed produce more than the world average. So if we did have that money, we would have produced even more, because there are knock-on effects, scale impacts, all those sort of things. But it means that we would have also attracted more capital. So whilst we, on a GDP per capita basis, have less money, on a GDP per person employed, we produce more. So if we can get that right, we can get richer quicker than the average of the world. That's what we should be doing. And it's not happening. We have to ask ourselves why. Because if it doesn't happen, look what happens. We sit with the highest unemployment rate of all the major economies in the world. And in 2018, we were the country with the highest unemployment rate in the world. Yes, there's a territory called Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, which had more. But no other country, none that they have data for, had a higher unemployment rate than ours. In the meantime, it's gone up. You can see for the fourth quarter of last year, you can see that Greece has half, and that's the next worst country of the countries at the back of the economist, half our unemployment rate. All our neighbors also are very high unemployment countries, very big governments, often very anti-profits, and the whole area is not seen, therefore, as a great place for the world to be in, invest in. And it would have been very different if we believed a bit more in profits. Let me give you another thing. I've showed you already that we have very few people actually working. We believe on the recent data, we know it's around 35%. But if we look at the data that the World Bank has, and that's typically 2018 and 2019 data, South Africa is way below all the other areas in the world in the ratio of adults employed. So we have less than 40%. We have less than South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, which have a culture where people do not employ women after they are married. It's just what happens in those areas. We are younger, far younger than the Euro area, which has more people on pension, yet we are below them. If we look at the world average, we are literally, virtually now 50% behind. I mean, they're at 58, we're at 39. So you get the idea. We are 50% less adults employed as a ratio to the world average. That makes a big, big difference. And the other thing that difference comes with is that in South Africa, very few people work for themselves. We have few employers as well, a bit more than some, but we have few employers. But we have a very small amount of people that work for themselves. We're around 15%. Sub-Saharan Africa, these data figures have now been updated, is about 5 times more than we are. Yes, they're poorer, but more of them are employed, and that means that you have less inequality. But apart from that, yes, North America and Europe are very advanced places. But even if you look at Eastern Europe, you look at Latin America and East Asia, which are now going beyond us, you see a lot more people are self-employed. And that tells you a story that because we don't tell people profits matter, and we don't look at policies to help people understand that they've got to make a living for themselves, and where we underpin their ability to do that by decreasing the tax rate on those businesses, by not looking at dividends, forget turnover tax, it's bullshit. It's very simply, we need to get there. And if we look at it, because we say profits don't matter, people are more likely to look for jobs. They don't see themselves as employing themselves. So it's a psychological element as well. And ironically, South Africa has 85% of its employed working for others. If you take the whole EU area, not just the Euro area, you will come up with a great surprise. South Africa has more people employed as a percentage than the Euro area in terms of the people that are employed, working for others, let's put it that way. Far fewer employers, far fewer self-employed. Or that is a problem. We need to get the employers and the self-employed, and we need to make them heroes. And for that, profits need to matter. If we had 3 million more jobs, inequality and poverty would be far, far lower. We would probably have less crime. More people will have an income. SA would be able to produce 20 or 25% more a year, which in itself would attract more fixed investment, which could mean another 1 million jobs. So it won't just be those 3 million. And the government would have more people and a bigger economy to tax, so it could reduce the tax burden on the few that are paying it, yet still produce better services and outcomes for the country. And we'll probably have a bigger incentive when more people are employed to catch the crooks and the corrupt, because it would change the balance of the voting public too. So is there any good news? Yes, there is some. There's another thing that's happened. Because we are not quite as self-confident, the South African non-financial corporations, according to the Bank of International Settlements, only have taken about 40% debt to GDP. A lot of this, and by the way, is Eskom and Transnet. So if you look at the real private sector, it's probably less than 30%. For the whole emerging markets, it's about 90%. That's with China. Because China's got a huge debt burden in their corporates, because they're growing so quickly, they are just going. And I'm not saying we should do that. We won't get there very quickly to a China level. But if we could go and aim for the sort of average emerging market ex-China, which is about 70%, that gives us another 30% of GDP, or roughly 1.5 billion or trillion, 1.5 trillion rand. So now we have the 3 trillion, and now if our corporations didn't have themselves being called capitalists and white monopoly capital, or being blamed for everything, that their risk tolerance would increase. and they would be able to take more loans. They would invest in more things. They wouldn't require as high a return, maybe even. So then we're looking at 4.5 million jobs, never mind the knock-on effect. So there you are. I've shown you 4.5 trillion rand. South Africa could have an economy today that's virtually double in size what it is today, with all the knock-on effects over a period of time, obviously, not in one go. I've just said all this. So then you look at why am I still positive? Well, the other impact is that we're back on a commodity high. Maybe it's not quite the super cycle, but we are getting near those highs for South African commodities, which is good news. It is in rand, but it is still going to impact, it isn't dollars, but it is going to impact us quite positively. You can see this last bit. It's really run up. If it wasn't for that, I think the fourth quarter GDP and also the third quarter wouldn't be half as good. And it has helped our businesses a lot more than government did. And the reason I'm quite positive about this, the metal prices typically outperform when interest rates are lower than inflation in America. And that seems to be the case and is likely to be the case for quite some time. So we are likely to see some sort of metal inflation, probably other commodities. We already see it in oil. That'll hit us later. Well, it'll hit us now, but I mean, at least the oil is only 15% or so of our imports. Our exports of metals and so on is close to 40%. So if we have a 50% increase in the 40% and a 50% increase in the 15%, our current account will still feel the benefits of that. And that'll be good for growth. It'll also be good for confidence. This money flows through the economy. It's likely to be there for a long time. We can see here, these are interest rates over the last 80 years in some advanced countries, and they've never been this low. And in the case of the UK, they haven't been as low as this for 300 years. They have records of. That's blown over to our side. We will probably get a bit of a rate increase, but not much. But it will mean that we're going to have low rates for a long time. So the incentive to invest and the cost of that investment, if you're going to lend some money from the bank, is not going to be that high. So I'm very positive that we should be using this time to do things and to do them properly. What do we need to do? Because now it's very easy to say, well, you have to do, or you've got all the problems. What do we do to solve it? Well, here's the first thing. The size of the South African general government expenditure as a percentage of GDP has doubled in 40 years. It is huge. It is unsustainably big. We need to reduce this to under 35%. Even that will put us amongst developed countries, not so much emerging countries. But we need to reduce that with at least that 8% of GDP. If we do that, we solve the budget deficit, we've solved the debt, we solve a lot of problems, and we can reduce taxes. And that's going to be very important going forward, because you'll see something else now. So at least half of that reduction will have to come from government employment, because here you can see our government expenditure, excluding social benefits. So let's still keep the poor. Let's help them. Let's make less people poor. Help those that remain poor with social benefits for now. But the point is, if we leave that out, we've got a bigger government than Denmark, Norway, Sweden, because they have more social benefits. We have a bigger government than any other country in the world that I can find. So ultimately, this is a huge general government that we have. It is far too big for South Africa, and that 38% must come down directly to far under 30%. You can see the one problem, our government compensation bill as a percentage of GDP is 15.2%. The rest of the 14 million people in South Africa share 40% of GDP, because our total compensation is roughly 56%. I'll show you that just now. The other thing is we also pay a lot of money for the cars and stuff that we import. And every time you buy a car, think of it like this. You're helping a Namibian or a Lesotho civil servant or Eswatini civil servant keep his job or her job. And you can see around us, something's gone wrong in Southern Africa, seriously wrong. A lot of countries in Southern Africa are trying to be Sweden, are trying to be something they're not. Afghanistan has a high number because they have a high military stance. So if you leave out Afghanistan, it's only Brazil that's outside of, and Honduras outside of the Southern African countries. Look there, there's Zambia, even Mauritius is high, Botswana, Mozambique, Eswatini, you get the idea. So we live in a neighborhood where civil servants eat up a lot of our money. And that, by the way, is also a reason for the unemployment. If you look at the taxation numbers in 2018, I'm busy with some of that work as well, you can really look and you get an idea that the top, say, 12%, except for the top 1%. So from, say, 99 or from number 2 to number 13, literally 40% of the people there are civil servants in that category. In the top category, it's probably only about 10%. If you then take out the financial, because that's where a lot of richer workers are, because it requires capital and human capital as such, then you really find that there are less people from the real economy, which we're talking, in the top earning category than the government civil servants have. So that says something as well. We need to reduce company taxes to a maximum of 14%. Why do I say 14%? Well, that's more or less where the middle country now is. The median country is now taxing roughly 14-15% taxes to some. We're at 28%. We're moving to 27%. We also don't give so many breaks as many other countries. And I'll tell you more about that. But we need to do that, and we need to find excise duties to increase along with that. Once we do that, we'll rebalance the economy, because at the moment, if we look at all the direct taxes, we're the 7th highest in the world. So if we look at the government revenue just overall, so this is all government revenue, it's not just taxes. So it includes the money that PRASA asks for its train. It includes the local government, not Eskom, local government, water and lights, because their gross profit margins at status were 72%, which means that virtually, they tripled the price to you in the public. So you can see here that we are one of the highest in the world overall, and this excludes social contributions, because ours in Australia and places like that, we're private, so is America. So I'm still paying a pension. It's just I'm not paying the pension to government. So it's one of the ways that everybody ranks this, the UN included, the IMF, or everybody. So you can see this is very, very high. And just on the taxation side, just so that you know what we're talking about here, our company tax burden is the 7th highest in the world. If we leave out Norway, because a lot of it is oil-based, we're 6th highest in the world. Our company tax burden is very high. And a country like Norway gives back a lot to those companies, making sure roads work, trains and passenger transport works so that people can get their employees to work on time. Our tax burden on the personal income tax side is the 10th highest in the world. Our total tax burden does not pay our civil servants even though it is the 10th highest in the world. It is shocking. VAT is about, or sales tax is about 53rd in the world. We're going to have to increase that, unfortunately. We've got 103 countries that charge that in the world. Not every country charges everything. So you also find that a lot of the oil countries have a big non-tax revenue, and makes it very hard to compare. But if we look at non-tax revenue, South Africa is the 14th highest of the non-oil exporters. Of the countries which main export is oil, would be then 23rd. So there are about 10 oil exporters, 9 of which have a higher non-tax revenue than us. So it's 151 countries with more than 1 million people that are compared here. Our trade taxes rank about 50th, but because we pay 85% of our customs revenue, and to Lesotho, Botswana, Swaziland, and so on, our neighbors are 4 of the top 5 rankings in income from international taxes, trade taxes, and that's because they take ours virtually. They are not 85% of this 5-country grouping. It's probably the other way around. They're 15%, we're 85%. And with that, we would rank in the top 30. So that's one area that we'll have to address that won't directly impact South Africa. But that's about 1% of GDP, but that can make all the difference. And we need to get something back for that. So the other thing that I think that we can sort out here is if we rethink the rankings, how we talk to business, how we talk to everybody in the country, and how we tell people what our responsibilities are and how our mind shift will have to work. This is important. This will make a huge difference in the rankings. Yes, we need to grow our GDP. Yes, we need to bring our debt under control. But if we don't just say it, but we start a whole process of shifting how we can change South Africa, and we make targets for own businesses. We make targets for each and every municipality which they have to fulfill that make sense, and do sensible things that countries all around the world do. We will see our ratings increase again. And once we do that, we will see a drop in interest rates. These are the interest rates and rankings as of the end of January this year. And it shows you there's a great correlation. But we could improve that by going over that line. And I think that would make about a 1% or so difference to our interest rates on the longer end. And that could help. And that would help bring back down the debt servicing burden. So there, I've told you now, we're literally missing 3 trillion in foreign direct investment because our policies are wrong and we don't concentrate on profits. I'm telling you that if we concentrate on profits and we lower the temperature of the hysteria and the red tape maybe, and even BEE will have to be up for grabs, we will see that 3 trillion maybe even become 4.5 trillion in investments. And that knock-on effect from those 4 million jobs, more or less, that we create out of that, could be another 1 million jobs or even more. So it could be very, very big for us as a country. And none of these things will cost us money necessarily that we have to spend more. It's actually a way of saying, let the supply side of the economy do its job. Let the supply side. We've been thinking, oh, if government demand can just be a bit more, and if government can do this and government can do that, and government just spends a bit more on teachers, although it's the same teachers or same doctors, we'll fix it. It's not going to get fixed. This is the way to fix it. And 3 trillion, as I've showed you, will flow into this country. Maybe not immediately, and probably maybe even 4.5, 5 trillion over the next decade if we do it properly. That's far more than corruption has cost us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Obviously, a lot of harshness in there, but I think here and there a few lights at the end of the tunnel. One wonders whether those lights are just more trains coming, but I guess time will tell. We have a few questions in the chat, so we'll get to those. Thank you, everyone. And if you have questions for Mike, please put them in the chat now, and I'll put those to him. Mike, as we were talking, Stats SA released the Q4 GDP numbers, so I wanted to get your, I guess, immediate thoughts on that, if you feel comfortable talking about it. So, according to Stats SA, the economy grew by 1.5% in Q4 2020, giving an annualized growth rate of 6.3%.
The annualized growth rate of 1.5.
Annualized growth rate of 6.3 in Q4. The economy grew by 1.5. Yeah.
Well, I think we expected quite a bounce back still,
right.
But it sounds like they've maybe adjusted some other quarters, just on my thinking, because 6.3 is definitely not what we thought it was. But 6.3% decline is still bigger than the world's decline, which is going to come in at roughly 4.5.
Okay.
So it shows that we've had a worse outcome. I think this year is going to be better than most people expected because of that bounce, now especially in the fourth quarter. I am very positive that we are going to head for, let's say, safer shores after this coronavirus thing in the next, just for the economy, just when we get out there. And once that happens, that'll be great. There will be sectors that will take time, like tourism and so on. But overall, I think, we've now got a chance of coming back by the end of 2023. It won't be 2022. It's still, because if you think of how statistics work, if you have a 10% decline and you go from 100 to a 90, you need a little bit more than 11% to get back. And if you have a 50% decline, you need to double to get back to 100. I often say to people who are doing negotiations, you should tell people you're going to cut salaries with 50%. And then they all, no. So no, it's fine, it's cut by 50%. But now we can increase it with 60%. And so people will think, great. And then they look back and they'll see they're only back at 80 Rand, not 100 Rand, when the whole exercise is done and they actually had a 20% cut in salaries. So that's just a statistical trick, but it is still very good, because 6% means that 6.3% probably means roughly 7% growth we need. So this year we'll get about 4%. Next year will be a bit less. Everybody knows that rates will go up a bit. We will have had a lot of that bounce. Then we hit that, the Eskom peak load and all those sort of things again, infrastructure constraints. So but it's good news. It means, we were thinking of 7.5, which meant roughly 8.5% increase. So yeah, now we got a good chance to get back by 2023, not 2024. So that's good news.
I will advise everyone to just maybe follow Mike on Twitter as well today, so you can see his continued commentary on the latest GDP numbers. The next question I had for you was around the debt to GDP ratio, and you mentioned 2023, 24 with the growth rate. So I want to ask, why is it so bad, or why would it be so bad? So I'm leading the witness here, but why would it be bad when we hit 100% debt to GDP ratio? What does that mean for the broader economy? Because again, it's these numbers. So what effect will that have on people's everyday lives?
Well, let's first say I don't know why the Maastricht criteria was 60%. We've gone over that. But I think richer countries, first of all, can sustain more debt. So when people say, but there's a Japan with 200% and so on, and these richer countries are also reserve currencies. So it's easier for them to print their own money and to set their own interest rates than it is for us. We're capital poor, so we need money. We need to borrow that money from somewhere. So interest rates in South Africa on the longer end are getting close to 10%. And that means if you've got 100% debt to GDP, just very simple, and you're paying 10%, it means you're paying 10% a year of your value in interest alone. And that's now for the government debt alone, not anybody else. And now government is about 40% of our economy, but it means that 25% of the sun. But government also only taxes 30%, and it's out of that tax that it pays that debt. And that it pays most things that government does, like salaries for teachers, medicine, and the like. And that's when the situation will get bad, because then, a third of your tax take goes just to paying off the debt. And we could even, once you get to those sort of levels, your interest rates start rising anyway. I mean, Bloomberg did an exercise, and they think that we could get to 13% of GDP by 2030, 13%, just paying back the interest. At that stage, it will be virtually half, because you won't be having a 30% tax take. You'll probably be, because of that pressure and because of the interest rates being high and the economy not growing, the tax to GDP ratio will probably be something like 25% or less. And under those circumstances, that means half your money, out of every R1 in taxes you collect, 50 cents has to go to paying off the debt. That doesn't leave much money to pay salaries, books, medicine, roads, dams, and bribes. That is a thing. I think the other reason why people are saying this is that at 130%, there's only been one country, and that's Japan, that hasn't had a debt crisis, a sovereign debt crisis at 130%. The other one is actually Belgium, but they changed currencies. They went to the euro, and they had that safety of a low interest rate, and they became part of a reserve currency. So they were saved there. The same applies to Greece. The same applies to but Greece had a sovereign debt crisis at 180%, despite being part of the euro. So a lot of the countries that get to that sort of level. Now, that's advanced countries I'm talking about at 130% and so on. They say that there's about a 20% to 30%, they've done the thing when a difference, when an emerging market gets into trouble. So it roughly works out to about 100 to 110% of GDP for an emerging market when you start hitting the skids. And already before that, you start seeing the rating agencies move to warn people and say there is a higher risk now. And that risk then is reflected in your interest rates, which means you already start paying back more and more. So the pressure is already on for you to change your ways. But I think that's the logic of it. That's the two reasons, I think. Chris?
Thanks. Let's jump into the comment section. First question from Stuart Pennington. Stuart asks, UCT research tells us that the informal sector employs plus minus 6 million people. Your graphs are the official figures, so what about the unofficial figures? When I drive around, I see a lot of informal activity. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, there is a lot of informal activity. I think a lot of people don't like saying that they have a work, perhaps. That's one thing that we've been thinking of for a long time. But I think what it also says to us, Stuart, is that we've got to be very careful how to interpret these figures. And that's why I'm using things like employment to population ratio. Because unemployment is also a definition, the official definition, we're at over 32% now. The broader extended definition is about 42%. But if you turn it around and you say, okay, no country in the world is at 100, it won't be, because there's always students, there's always housewives and the like. But we're at a stage in South Africa now where we have to sort of say to ourselves, look, when we've got a 40% on people working, only 40%. So, and of that 40%, only about 29% or even less now are in the formal sector. So if I look at all the adults in South Africa, or say the whole formal non-agricultural sector is 10 million out of roughly 39 million people, that's about a quarter. That's your income tax base, because the informal sector says the guy isn't registered for income tax, not registered for UIF. That's the problem. So your tax base there is only VAT, is only excise duties. It's not personal income tax. It's not a company tax, and very often it's also part of the slipping of the tax net. For example, if a guy's selling liquor or cigarettes without the tax taken off by government because it's smuggled. So maybe that's the thing we can look at as well. But the point is, 25% of South African adults are in the formal sector, more or less.
Our next question is from Mike Setas. Mike, thank you for the question. Do you believe there is sufficient political will or, in fact, knowledge to bring about the necessary policy changes you mentioned? Matters like expropriation without compensation, national health insurance, bloated bureaucracy, etc. So, Mike, I think other Mike is leading the witness here, but let's see what you think.
Well, I'll say this. I think our government has some operations going where they are trying to get things going, but it's not the big questions yet. It's not about profits. It's not about the political capital of that government would have to spend. I think government needs to understand that you need to put your political capital down in this. Otherwise, if politics triumphs, then the economy will have a very big decline, and it will eventually eat up your politicians too. So I think what we need in South Africa is government to please do what the NHI, take the budget, don't add on to government spending, take away from government spending. Don't create more uncertainty, create more certainty. Don't take away people's stuff. If you're going to take people's land, and it may even be more than that, as I understand it now, it might be other sorts of property, and at the same time you want to play around with people's pension funds and the like, you're going to run out of money very quickly, because people are going to not take that lying down. They will rather pay the taxes now, which will give you a year or two boost, but after that you will have nothing, and you will find that people leave. And if you look, there's something very interesting that nobody sort of picks up, but the number of taxpayers in South Africa, the pay-as-you-earn taxpayers, the people that are actually paying personal income tax, has been declining. And it has declined from around 7.4 million. Yes, there's been a crisis, so now we're at 6.9 million. But ultimately, the lower income groups have come up quite quickly, but we've increased the tax threshold, so that's also played a role. But the big issue here is that the number of people are not increasing. So even if all things remain equal, you cannot load those people on more and more on them. And that's why they're leaving. And that's where some people are estimating the numbers from that 23,000 taxpayers per year are leaving at the higher end. Let's say at the 200,000 Rand per year and more end. And that gives you an idea as to what's going on. So when you look at these Treasury estimates and SARS estimates as to how many people are in pay-as-you-earn, you have to see that that's actually been declining. And that's been declining before the COVID crisis hit us. And maybe that should be a wake-up call. Because if you create more uncertainty, you're going to find very quickly more people are going. Yeah, leaving.
Our final question, Mike, is from Toby Chance. Thank you, Toby, for the question. Mike, have you got any traction with Treasury and the presidency with this presentation?
No.
Maybe if we tweet them, we'll just do a tweet storm.
Yeah, I think the big thing here is that we have to first make this clear to a lot more people, I think, because I think the current government is stuck in a way of thinking that the world has surpassed it. If you look just this year on the manufacturing of emerging markets only, and you can even leave out China if you want out of it. If January was 100, last year, January 2020 was 100 for South Africa and emerging markets in general. We're now at 97. We've done a bit of a recovery. We all went down and then we came back. We're at 97, say. They are at 114. We are acting more like a very big advanced economy. We are not understanding what's going on. And country after country is surpassing us. So we have to get this information out there first. When South Africa became a democracy, there was a little bit less countries, but we were 62nd in the per capita income states in the world. In 2019, we were 107th, with Sri Lanka overtaking us. Now, when we became a democracy, Sri Lanka was a poor little country that some people were trying to help play cricket, and they weren't quite in the big league at all. And now our coaches or our ex-coaches are going there to make an income because they've now surpassed us. And it's the next 3 or 4 years might only be 3 or 4 countries that surpass us. But at current growth rates, by the time we get to 2030, we're going to see a lot more countries surpass us. It's a bit of a gap. And then we can easily slip beyond the first 120 countries. And I don't know when it happens, but people are forgetting about us. The analysts that used to call 10 years ago hardly call. And if I do get calls, it's from hedge fund analysts and from people who are looking to make a quick buck out of our poor performance. And that is a problem. So the fact of the matter is we must run South Africa more and more like a business, if you wish. And we've got to convince people of that. But we've also got to convince enough of the public that profits matter. We've got to convince enough of the public that profits will lead to more employment. More employment will lead to less poverty and inequality. It is the way the world has got ahead. There is no other proven way. There is no 14th way or whatever. And I think that political pressure will have to come to bear. I think our current president is not taking political chances as he should for his country. He's putting his own career first. Saying anything else, in my opinion, would be a lie.
Thank you, Mike. I think that's a good note on which to end. You've given us a lot of food for thought today. And of course, it falls to a lot of us, people who are watching, listening, also to get this message out there. And you do that, of course, by supporting organizations like the FMF and sharing this information with people around you in your communities, your WhatsApp groups. When people complain about the lights being off or the water running in the street, those are all effects of the ideas and policies that this government has implemented. So use these numbers and try and educate people and help them see how important it is to get the policies right. But Mike, thank you very much for your time today. I think it's been an illuminating presentation from you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Viewers and listeners, thank you for your time once again with us today. We really enjoy having you with us. Thank you for all the questions, of course, and your engagement. We hope that you found the presentation useful and fruitful. Please remember to leave a like on this video, and please also, if you haven't yet subscribed to the FMF's YouTube channel, you can find all our articles and press releases on www.freemarketfoundation.com. And there you can also, if it's possible for you, please also consider donating to our annual challenge fundraiser. We really need your support. It means a lot to us, and it means we can continue doing this kind of work. So if you can spare a couple of rand, please consider supporting us. On that note, we will end for today. Have a good day going forward. Take care, and we'll chat to you again very soon. Cheers.